Order. Order. Jamie Stone to move the motion.
Thank you, Mrs. Harris. I beg to move that this House has considered E-petition 700143 relating to a general election. It is, as I said already, a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And as chair of the Petitions Select Committee, I believe I speak for all its members, and I bet a whole heap of politicians in this Parliament, when I say that it is always encouraging to witness public participation in politics. At over 3.1 million signatures, it is evident this particular petition has engaged a truly vast number of people all across the country. For this reason, I must personally and most sincerely thank its creator, Mr. Michael Westwood, who is with us with his wife, Tanya, who I had the pleasure of meeting during the run-up to this petition before Christmas. We had a long chat. Mr. Westwood, Michael Westwood, created this e-petition with a clear and very simple call. Michael Westwood would like there to be another general election on account of the fact that he believes the current Labour government has gone back on the promises they made during the lead-up to the last election, which was held, as we all know, in July 2024. When Michael Westwood and I spoke, Michael explained that his reason for creating this petition came from his personal frustration at the lack of transparency and, indeed, accountability within our election process. He feels that the system does not ensure that the government of the day is made answerable for unfulfilled manifesto promises and poor governments. Put simply, Mr. Westwood believes that it is too easy for political parties, all of us, to mislead the public in order to gain their vote. In the case of our current government, he believes that there is yet no sign of Labour's pledge to kickstart the economy even after 6 months in office.
Would the honourable gentleman
I will give way to my honourable friend with the greatest pleasure.
Thank you very much, with my gratitude. Would my honourable friend agree that while the government has committed to growth, increasing national insurance contributions to the extent that small businesses, the lifeblood of our economy, are having to lay off staff is an odd way to go about it?
I thank my honourable friend for her intervention, and indeed that is one particular matter I shall touch on shortly. I'd suggest that on account of the sheer number of signatories to Michael's petition, it's only reasonable to assume that his feelings are similarly held by a great number of people currently living in the UK. But before I go on to explore the technicalities of this request for an election, I do want to address the purpose of petitions and their significance within our political system as we have it today in the UK. Let's remember, petitions are first and foremost a mechanism of civic engagement and political expression. As individual politicians, each and every one of us only resides in this place, in this House, at the behest of our constituents. And it is surely paramount that a dialogue is always facilitated between ourselves and with the public. Now, I would say to colleagues, whether we agree or disagree with Mr. Westwood's petition, we should not lose sight of the fact that a petition that garners this much support is surely, I would suggest, the sign of a healthy democracy. The fact that we're here today in this place debating this matter is surely evidence that we live in a democracy where our electorate can express discontent and can demand our attention and know that we will listen to them and take their concerns seriously. Ultimately, I would suggest we work for all those who put their name to this petition. We work for all of them. And I believe that the government should welcome their input as a sign that our representative democracy in the UK is alive and well, which I would suggest is a lot more than can be said for far too many other parts of the world where it is not alive and well at all. But all this said, the petition system that was created to bring Parliament's attention to issues of policy on which there is strong public feeling, it was not ever intended as a mechanism to circumvent parliamentary democracy or change the terms by which it is conducted. Creating a petition is a means of advocacy and participation. A petition is not an autonomous decision-making tool which can act as a substitute for a representative democracy. We need to remember these important principles. But I will give way to my honourable friend.
Does my honourable friend agree, however, that the petition allows the public to express their anger and disappointment at the failure of the Labour government to deliver on so many pledges? And appositely, at this moment, when we had sub-zero temperatures across Scotland in the last few days, particularly on the withdrawal of the winter fuel payment, when it had been promised that that would be retained.
I do thank, and I correct myself, my right honourable former colleague from the Scottish Parliament, and he makes the point which I will touch on shortly on that very particular issue. I would also like to invite my right honourable colleague to perhaps surmise that things were rather better with petitions in this place than in another place where we once served, but we'll leave that aside for the moment. Can I put it very simply? An election cannot be called as a result of a petition. It simply cannot. It is a fact that on the 4th of July, the Labour Party won a majority and he will remain in office for the duration of their term. That is a fact. Or until, and this is important, or until the Prime Minister seeks permission from the Sovereign to dissolve Parliament at a time of his choosing. That is the way we do things in this country. And let me say furthermore, it is, I think, absolutely intrinsic to the proper functioning of democracy to respect and uphold the democratic mandate the current government holds from the British public. It is, I would assert, a mandate which cannot be overturned by this petition or any other future petition. To do so would fundamentally undermine the existing institutional and constitutional mechanisms that empower the public. The British people did have their say in July. They chose the current government, and we must continue to honour that choice. I believe that's a fundamental principle to the way we do things in this country. I most certainly, with pleasure.
Honourable gentleman for giving way. He touches on that word about a mandate, and I think most people would accept and acknowledge that the government was elected on a mandate for change. But would he agree with me that one of the reasons there's so much traction and engagement for this petition, including in my own constituency, is because people feel so let down and disappointed that what we have seen are so many manifesto promises that have already been broken?
I accept the point made by the right honourable member. I would, however, remind her that I am the servant of the House and have to be an impartial chairman in this matter. And I think we all know that's the way this place works. Tempting though it might be for me to say something, it would, however, be very, very wrong. But I may touch on some things like that in due course. It is the case, however, that the government must, I would suggest, respectfully acknowledge the frustration of those who signed the petition and do their utmost to understand the motivation of these good people who signed the petition. In response, let us remind ourselves, in response to this petition, the Cabinet Office reassured the public that it was committed to, we know what they said, fixing the foundations, rebuilding Britain and restoring public confidence in government. In particular, the Cabinet Office cited the £22 billion black hole as the reason for the very, very difficult decisions that have had to be made in the past and will be made in the future. None of them are easy, and in all fairness, we should recognise that. In recent months, we have witnessed widespread dissatisfaction with various policy decisions the government has chosen to make. And this has been touched on a few minutes ago by other members, the decision to cut winter fuel payments, to terminate inheritance tax, exemptions on farms and increase national insurance for employers are three of the issues which have proved controversial. And that is the case in all our constituencies, including mine, regardless of the colour of the member who represents that particular constituency. We know that from the press comment in itself. Returning to our guest here, the man who raised the petition, Mr. Michael Westwood, he placed specific emphasis on economic growth as a motivation for creating this petition and made his dissatisfaction with the government's response clear. This is, I would suggest, an example of precisely the sort of dialogue that petitions should initiate. I learnt something from my discussions with Mr Westwood, and I think we can all learn from that. And I do very much hope that this debate will help the government address some of the inadequacies that have been identified. I think I speak for us all when I say that we all want to see an economy in which large and small businesses can thrive and prosper. That's what drives the nation. We all want to see an NHS which is properly funded, so everyone can get the care they need. And we want to see a society that has proper safeguards so the most vulnerable are protected from all the horrors that might come their way. We shall stop as best we can. These are, however, let's face it, let's be honest, they're all huge ambitions. They're very proper ambitions, and they're right ambitions. They're ones that we should sign up to, but they're going to be expensive. They're not cheap, and allocating resources fairly and necessarily will be a challenge for a government of any particular colour. Can I be so bold to suggest that we can improve engagement still more in the way that this our Petitions Committee does, and I hope that the communication will improve in the months and years ahead of this particular debate. And I hope that the government can also be involved in that sort of discussion and deliberation. The electorate must be reassured that all of us, as their representatives, who are here at their behest, that we're willing to listen to their needs. I think that any government would be wrong to assume that it acts in a vacuum. Exclamations will always be necessary in a democracy as long-standing and as robust as ours, one that I believe is the envy of many other parts of the world. Now, we have a particularly well-attended debate today, which is, I find, as the chair of the Select Committee, immensely encouraging. I'm sure we're going to hear some most interesting and thoughtful contributions. I will draw my remarks to a close at that, Mrs Harris, and we'll listen with great interest to what follows. Thank you very much indeed.
Before I continue with the debate, can I just bring to everyone's attention that guests in the gallery are not permitted to contribute in any way to the debate, that any member who speaks needs to stay for wind-ups, and we will be on a very tight time of 6 minutes per speech. And can I please encourage colleagues to make short interventions, or there will be people who will not be able to speak at the end of the debate. The question is that this House has considered E-petition 700143 relating to a general election. I call Yasmin Qureshi.
Thank you, Karen, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. Can I start off by saying that petitions normally in our Parliament have been used often to discuss a particular issue of concern to people in the country. I have to say it's not normally used as a mechanism to hijack and play party politics. In the last 14 years, we saw crisis after crisis caused by the ill-thought policies and plans and the rank colonialism of the previous government. But unlike that, we engaged in the process, we had debates, we did not commandeer a public petition to demand a new election. We opposed the government, we worked within the parliamentary ambit to do what was right. This petition has grown, some of it to do with a lot of misinformation, some of it to do with foreign interference, and I do think, yes, well, you may laugh at it, but that happens to be correct as well. Ms Harris, we found, when we took over the government, I want to make some points and then I'll take intervention. We found that when Labour got elected, they found the first thing was £20 billion of deficit, a big black hole, which no one knew about. So therefore, of course, we had to take decision to actually... Ms Harris, I would... Oh, do you know what? You can try to shout and scream, whatever. I'm not going to give up, so let me speak, please, whoever is making the noises. Right. 20 billion black hole. Obviously, therefore, the government had to take some policies in order to plug that black whole. And that means about rising the winter fuel, it means introducing inheritance tax, it means the national insurance contribution, things that people have been mentioning in the petition. You have to recognise that if you're going to provide services, if you're going to bring changes into the country, it does require financial expenditure, and a 20 billion deficit was not one anyone knew about. Now, when we took over, we found that our prisons were incredibly overcrowded. The government had said that they would find 20,000 prison places by mid-20s, but they only created 50. In our criminal justice system, we've had victims waiting for trial in serious cases in the Crown Court, about at least 7,300 of them. But what we had during when the Conservatives were in power, we had about, I think, 8 different Secretary of States for Justice. Therefore, not surprising that our judicial system and prison system is in a complete mess at the moment. In relation to the NHS, I can remember in 2010 when we came into power, the waiting list when you went into an accident emergency in a hospital was maybe for a few hours. Now it's 8 hours, 10 hours. And of course, in order to get an operation or see a doctor, it's years now as opposed to 6 months. And again, that is because we've had this government the previous government, not dealing anything to do with it. So we've had to deal with this, and that means we hear the step being made by the Secretary of State for Health, and there will be a debate later on about all the things that we want to bring into play to make our NHS system work better, because people need that. We are the party that came in and solved the doctors' dispute, which has been going for years and years. And why does that matter? Because it means that our health service will have good, decent provision, and some of the delays, hopefully, will be taken away. And, of course, the Prime Minister even today mentioned about the fact that we've got plans to reduce the waiting list massively. Now, these are things that we're doing. The previous government, 14 years, did nothing and left us with what we are. We are the government that actually has paid our teachers more so that our children can be educated properly. We're the government that has actually dealt with the issue of public transport as well, drivers and strikes. And that's important because we need to get the country going. Public transport is very important to the proper running of any country, and of course we need to do that. Recently, just before Christmas, we announced over £1 billion for people who are homeless and £1 billion or so for potholes as well. All of these things, and it was touched upon this year of regenerating the economy, these will of course solve the problems of bad roads and of course help people who are homeless and be able to sleep warmly, but also of course building our roads creates jobs and it regenerates the economy. We've said we will build more than 1.5 million houses. What will that do? That will regenerate our economy as well, where everybody's talking about, how do we regenerate the economy? The stuff that we're doing on green energy, renewable, that will create loads of jobs as well and regenerate our economy. So all these people, when they kind of, I hear some members here, especially in the opposition, sort of sniggering and laughing about things. Well, you know what? Some of you were MPs for the last 14 years, as I have been as well. You know the failures of your government. So, Ms Harris, I go back on, in 6 months I can only talk about a few things, but I think there's enough that the Labour Party has been doing, the government has been doing, to ensure not only that our economy is regenerated, but also that many, many institutions are properly financed, especially our health service, which everyone uses, and it's so important that we look after that. And we are, the Labour Party created the NHS, and we are the party that will always look after and save the NHS.
Sir Edward Lee.
We all know that we live in a parliamentary democracy that there need to be an election until the summer of 2029, and there probably won't be one, however many petitions are produced. But I think it would be foolish to ignore this petition as an expression of public disappointment and anger. And I don't want to be overtly party political here, but I do think that it would be useful for the government not just to dismiss this petition as being cooked up abroad, apparently, or by nefarious forces, anti-democratic forces. I think I think it'd be quite wise to listen to the public. I mean, if you are in a black hole, if indeed there is a black hole, I mean, I do say to the government, just stop digging. And if you've got to raise money, there are mechanisms such as income tax. Where I'll give way. Yes, the honourable lady. Yes.
Thank you very
Rachel
much.
Gilmore.
Madam Chair, would the honourable member agree that the essence of this petition is in fact the political manifestation of buyer's remorse, and that the delivery and introduction of proportional representation would not lead to such remorse so soon?
Edward Lee.
Well, actually, the Liberal Party seem to have done very well from this system. By focusing their attacks on Conservative constituencies, they seem to have many more seats, for instance, than the Reform Party, and less votes, but I'll leave that aside. No, I don't want to get involved in all this. Well, no, I've given away once. I'll conclude my remarks within the time limit. So I think it'd be quite foolish for the government just to ignore this. And I think that, if I may just give some fatherly advice, it's always good to compromise when you're bringing in reforms. For instance, if you were worried about winter fuel payments going to everybody, perhaps you should have cancelled them to higher taxpayers. There would have been very little controversy about that. But when you take a winter fuel allowance from somebody whose total income is only $13,000 a year, that is bound to cause great hardship. Or again, if you're worried about larger states escaping from any inheritance tax, perhaps you should have focused your tax on the very largest estates of more than 1,000 acres, rather than just picking on family farms of 250 acres. Or if you want to rake in more money from national insurance, perhaps you should have absolved, for instance, hospices from those proposals. So I just give that advice to the government. I mean, of course they won't take it, but it's always useful, if you are bringing in reforms, to think of the general public and how it will impact on people and how it relates to their sense of alienation. And that's what I want to talk about now, because there is undoubtedly a sense of alienation in the country. And it is partly due to the issues that I've been talking about, but it's also general issues. And I sit on the Council of Europe and I see how other countries in France and Germany and Italy are coping with political unrest. And unless the two major parties actually listen to the public and respond to their concerns, then we will simply see the rise of more and more populism in this country, of far-right and far-left parties. And I think that there is a particular issue, and this is what I want to talk about, where people feel alienated. They cannot understand how it is in a country like ours that in the last year something like 35,000 people jump the queue, cross the channel, are put in hotels forever and stay here forever and break the rules. They can't understand why no government, either the previous Conservative government or apparently this government, is actually solving this problem. Now, they're not going to follow us in our Rwanda policy, I know that. But they simply can't talk in easy terms about smashing the gangs when we all know that unless you have an offshoring policy, you're never going to stop people crossing the channel and making us a laughingstock in the world. And another issue that I want to talk about, where people feel very frustrated, is the sheer level of legal migration. And this is a point that I like to put particularly to the party opposite. This is not a sort of right-wing point of view. This is Matthias Tesfaye. He's the Danish immigration minister, and he's a son of Ethiopian refugees. If you look, he says, at the historical background, it is completely normal that left-wing politicians like me are not against migration, but want it to be under control. If it isn't, and it wasn't since the 1980s, low-income and low-educated people pay the highest price for poor integration. It is not the wealthy neighbourhoods that have to integrate most of the children. On the contrary, the areas where the traditional social democratic voters and trade unionists live face the greatest problems. So I think that both parties have to solve this problem of the sheer level of legal migration and illegal migration. And I'll make one other point, that we all believe that we must solve climate change, but we must do it in a moderate and sensible way. And many people in rural areas, such as the areas I represent, are not only worried about the farmer's tax, but if you live in Gainsborough, you see that 10,000 acres around your small town are going to be covered with solar farms. Let's have more solar farms on rooftops, on industrial warehouses, but when people see that their good agricultural land is being taken away from this, and these solar panels made by dodgy Chinese companies, benefiting large landowners, that again leads to a sense of alienation. So I just think that both parties have to listen to the people. They cannot just go full ahead with their own policies, ignoring what many people are frustrated about. And there's one last point. We've just had this debate in the main chamber about the NHS and social care. Frankly, we have to have some sort of cross-party consensus of how we're going to pay for our increasingly elderly population. We can't just throw brickbats at each side. So it's the fault of the Labour government, it's the fault of the Conservative government. We're all living longer. We're all going to be more frail in our old age. We're all going to need more and more help. There has to be some sort of political consensus of how we're going to pay for it. And my own view is we're going to have to pay for it by some form of social insurance. So my advice to the government is that you can ignore this petition. Of course, you will ignore this petition in the sense there won't be a general election, but don't ignore the sense of alienation and frustration that lies behind it.
Yeah. Walker.
Mrs Harris, it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I have the privilege of speaking here today because 6 months ago the country voted for change. Yeah. The biggest change, in fact, that this Parliament has seen in generations. And we know why people voted for change, because for 14 years the Conservatives have been taking the country down a road that's left everybody worse off. NHS waiting lists spiralling out of control, no grip on the prison crisis, no plan for the economy, no control on the cost of living crisis. And we stood on a manifesto of setting that right. And that is why the general election we've just had has reduced the Tories to the smallest number in their history. And ours was a message of hard work, of sorting out the mess they made that everyone could see. But for all their failures, actually, I think that one of the cruelest things that the last government did was to take away hope. And to take away the belief that things can be changed, not by gimmicks, not by slogans, but by doing the work. And by doing the right thing, I'm going to make some more progress, thank you, but by doing the work and by doing the right thing, even when it's difficult. And I know the frustration that people feel after years of chaos and neglect from their government, from two governments, as a matter of fact, in the case of Scotland. But I would say this to everyone who feels let down by 14 years of broken promises. And it's this. It's what the last government did, lurching from crisis to crisis, from drama to drama, is not the way to make people's lives better. They dodged the difficult decisions, and we're not doing that. It's been just 6 months since we were elected, and we've already increased funding to the NHS, protected the pensions triple lock, invested in housing, and delivered the biggest settlement to Scotland in the history of devolution. And we've set a budget that's funded all of this while protecting the pay packets of working people. Our manifesto said that we would stabilise the economy and rebuild public services, and that is what we're doing. The job is far from finished, but we will get there. And to the members opposite, I'd ask what's happened to their party? Because the Tory party we once knew were the biggest winners in Britain's electoral history, but they now sit here, diminished, and looking round, as they always do, for someone else to blame. But of course, blaming the voters is never the right thing to do. And I'm not going to criticise the people who signed this petition, because we all feel the frustration of the last decade and a half of what it's like not to be able to get what you need for yourself and your family. And when they've been let down, I'm going to finish soon, so I'm going to make progress. And when you have been let down so badly, and for so long, people don't forget. They don't forget quickly, and I understand that. But fixing this country isn't a 6-month job. And the members opposite must be honest that it took them longer than that to get us into this mess. So I know that people have had their hope trampled on. But better times do lie ahead. And this Labour government is here to see that we get there.
Yeah. Francois.
Thank you very much, Harris, and a Happy New Year to you and everyone else in this important debate, ably introduced by the Chairman of the Petitions Committee. It's an extraordinary thing that we're debating a petition calling for a general election barely 6 months from the previous one. And it's even more extraordinary, it generated over 3 million signatures in just a few weeks. It's also highly noteworthy that of the 650 parliamentary constituencies in the UK, 6 of the top 10, in terms of numbers of signatures, come from the county of Essex, including my own constituency of Rayleigh and Wickford among them at number 8. Yes, I don't see an Essex Labour MP here. Having spoken to my constituencies at their surgeries out and about in my patch and having seen their emails, perhaps I could suggest some reasons why. Firstly, the economy. During the general election campaign, Labour's then Shadow Chancellor gave a major speech in late May on Labour's economic policy, were they to win. In that speech, she famously promised that all of Labour's policies were, I quote, fully costed and fully funded. And she said as a result there'd be no need for any further tax increases if they won in July. Then within 4 months in the budget, the very same person announced a gigantic £40 billion of tax increases on everything from national insurance, inheritance tax, stamp duty, capital gains, farming, landlords, pubs, school fees, and even potentially service widows. Her justification for this, one of the largest tax increases in British peacetime history, was this supposed £22 billion black hole, even though £9 billion of that was caused by a combination of public sector wage increases, including for junior doctors and train drivers, taken after Labour came to office, as the public were all too aware. So Labour's central economic proposition, the need to fix this supposed black hole, was a sham from the start. That's why it's never been taken on by the public, who saw right through it right from the start. Then the winter fuel allowance. They gave the same justification for withdrawing that from up to 10 million pensioners. That was an option long favoured by Treasury mandarins, which Labour often accused us of being willing to implement, although we never did. It was a Labour Chancellor that eventually did it, supposedly to save £1.5 billion in a full year. However, such has been the subsequent shift among pensioners to sign up for pension credit, largely in order to keep getting the allowance, that a large part of that £1.5 billion has already effectively disappeared and could be negated entirely, thus proving to be a total own goal, not just morally, but financially as well. My neighbour and colleague, the member for Castle Point, reports over 20,000 pensioners have had their winter fuel allowance withdrawn in her constituency, and as she puts it, they and their families are furious with Labour. Then we have Labour's so-called plans for devolution, as outlined in the White Paper before Christmas. In Essex, this would replace a two-tier system of local government with another two-tier system of local government instead, but one which would take decisions even further away from local people. It's a Trojan horse designed to concrete over our green belt and based largely, if you read the White Paper, on Sadiq Khan's systems in Essex. Well, I can tell you the last thing we want in Essex is another Sadiq Khan. And then the small boats, and there's great frustration about it. Labour promised to smash the gangs, that was their slogan. And that's what it was. It's a slogan, not a policy. And the smuggling gangs remain decidedly unsmashed. Instead, without any credible deterrent, the small boats keep coming. They're up by a third since Labour took office, while Labour clearly have no plan whatsoever. So they're going to keep coming while the government looks on. So many of Labour's plans were based on economic growth. From us, they inherited the fastest growing economy in the G7. It was, and it's now flatlining. It's flatlining under Labour. That's why we had the 5 missions, now the 6 milestones. So we'll have the 7 wonders of the world. You cannot increase growth by whacking up taxes across the entire British economy. So in summary, Ms Harris, of the 7,287 people in my Rayleigh and Wickford constituency who signed the petition, we can't know why every one of them signed up, Perhaps it's because they were enraged that Labour promised no new tax increases, then put them up by 40 billion quid. Perhaps it was they're among the 10 million pensioners, up to 10 million, who've had their winter fuel allowance taken away by the Chancellor. Perhaps they're part of the 3.8 million waspy women led up the garden path by Labour for the PM downwards prior to the general election and then dumped unceremoniously thereafter. Perhaps it's because they believe Labour's promises to smash the gangs, only to see arrivals increase by a third since Labour took office. Or now, perhaps they just realised that when Labour promised change, what they really meant was more taxes, more bureaucracy and even more votes. Whatever it was, we now have a Labour government which, by breaking so many of its promises so early to those that elected them, has already all but surrendered its moral right to govern. The British people, they want change, all right. They want a change from Labour, and the sooner the better.
Can I remind members that the list is here, but if you do not stand, I will not call you. Alistair Stratton.
Thank you, Mrs Harris. It's a real pleasure to serve under your chairship again. And it's a real privilege to serve here as MP for my constituency. Over 6 months ago, I had the privilege of being elected to represent the towns and villages I live in again. There is really no greater privilege of being an MP and getting to champion the representation and change that politics, when done right, can deliver. And it's in that spirit that I'd like to thank the petition organiser and all those who engaged in this petition in good faith. I'm sure he and many of those here today did, for bringing this matter to our attention today and for instilling the level of interest that this debate has doubtless generated outside of this place. There is, I'm sure, a great deal that he and me would disagree about, and I'm sure that will be true in 5 years' time as true as it is now. But I think we probably both agree that for far too long, far too many politicians have taken our electorates for granted and have let people down. And that is something none of us, whatever political party we're here to represent today, should allow to continue any further. Because while it's not the first time I've been elected to serve my community, it's felt like a time for me where the stakes couldn't be higher. Throughout the election, I heard some truly heartbreaking stories. People whose health had been allowed to deteriorate to breaking point by a health service that just wasn't there for them anymore when they needed it. Families whose lives had been squeezed and narrowed beyond all recognition by cost of living pressures that simply weren't of their making. And far too many people who'd lost faith in the very basic ability of the state to do the simple things right, keeping our borders secure, fixing our roads and showing people that politics can be a force for good. Against that backdrop, being elected again in this fragile time and as a party of government is a deep responsibility, one which I and colleagues on this side of the debate today I know take incredibly seriously. Throughout the election, we were under no illusions that we would be inheriting challenging circumstances, but no one could have predicted the depth of challenges that we'd be inheriting. Public services way past beyond breaking point, far further than imagined. Prisons closer to being overflowing. Our health service even more on its knees. And the point at which the NHS had to advise our incoming health secretary that we should be cutting appointments, let alone expanding them, a point when we had record waiting lists. This was an unacceptable inheritance and one far beyond what we've been led to believe we'd be picking up. And yes, public finances in an even worse situation with a black hole that was growing, verified by the Treasury, the IFS and the OBR, and would only get worse without robust action. Now, I'm as angry about these stories as anyone. I completely understand why these are frustrating things to hear. I'm frustrated and I know my colleagues are. But we were doing everyone, not least our country and our constituents, a disservice if we didn't face up to them and the tough choices they inherited. They meant we had to inherit. Only Rishi Sunak will know why he called an early election, but it's pretty clear, given our inheritance, it certainly wasn't because he thought things could only get better. I'm glad, though, however difficult, to have the privilege of being part of a party that will now have to wrestle with the tough choices we need to rebuild faith with you and to start fixing things for our constituents. And I'm glad that we're not shying away from that. It would have been easy to will away the black hole, to will away the scale of some of these problems, to have a budget that tinkered round the edges, to introduce reforms that tinkered round the edges of some of the challenges. But we're not doing that. There's no doubt that this budget was a big budget, and it was a big budget because we needed to make some big choices. They weren't easy. If they were, even the last party might have been able to make them. But we faced up to them because we could not continue to tolerate a situation where too many of my constituents wait for too long to see a doctor. Too many young people in my constituency with additional needs wait too long to have those met. And far too many of the very basic things that every citizen should be able to count upon their government for. Border security, fixed roads, a functioning economy simply weren't happening. Yes, I'm under no illusions that these choices have brought with them some pain too. And it is for us over the course of the next 5 years to work closely with our communities to show them that these choices have been worthwhile, to show them that we're using that money to good end, to deliver on the things that you've elected us to change. Over the next 5 years, that is my mission, and that is the mission of everyone on this side of the House. I've no doubt we'll make some mistakes along the way. I certainly will. But I hope that in 5 years' time, or whenever the next election is called, to be able to go back to you, to be able to go back to our electorates and to talk to you about the changes we've been able to have, to show you the difference the Labour government's made for our health service, to show you the difference a Labour government has been able to make for the incomes of working people, to design and deliver an economy that's truly working for our communities again. For far too long, we've accepted managed decline and a broken political settlement in this country. I have no doubt it's not going to be easy. It certainly hasn't been an easy first 6 months. But I'm incredibly proud to be part of a party that's facing up to those difficult choices and remains resolute in our resolve to deliver for people, to show people, choice by choice, decision by decision, that things can get better again. And we will be doing everything we can to ensure they do. Thank you.
Raj.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I generally find the best ideas in life come from pubs, so it's no particular surprise that Michael Westwood is indeed a publican. And representing Clacton, we were third on the highest number of people to sign this petition. But I don't think the 8,000 people in Clacton that signed this did so just to get a fresh general election, because they knew that wouldn't happen. What they were actually expressing was a sense of utter disenchantment with the entire political system. And this debate can be used as a game of ping-pong this afternoon between the two political parties that have dominated British politics since the end of the First World War. But actually something bigger is going on out there. Have a look at the turnout. The second lowest turnout ever in a general election, despite the introduction of mass postal voting. Have a think about the fact that the Labour Party got a third of the vote and 2/3 of the seats. For every Labour MP, there are 34,000 votes. For every Reform MP, 820,000 votes. When you think about that and give it some context, perhaps it's not surprising that confidence in the whole system is breaking down. Now, I have to say, having studied politics for a long time, not as long as the father of the House, obviously, but over 50 years, I can't think of a government that has seen a collapse in confidence as quickly as this one has. There are 26,000 pensioners in the constituency of Clacton alone that are losing their winter fuel allowance. They had no idea this was going to happen on the day of the general election. There are 100 family farms just in the Clacton constituency, many that I've met that frankly are in tears because they can't see how their husbandry of that land that has gone on in some cases for hundreds of years is going to be able to survive inheritance tax. And with the national insurance increases, yet another hammer blow to the men and women running small businesses in this country. They had not expected this. They were promised it wouldn't happen in the run-up to the general election. And we find that even now affects GP surgeries in the constituency and hospices close to it. So perhaps you can see why people are upset. They feel things are being done to them they didn't have realistic expectations of. But the broader problem, I think, is the economy as a whole. The economy works on confidence. People borrow money, lend money according to confidence in each other. And in the Prime Minister and the Chancellor of the Exchequer, I mean, we've got two people who look like they're going to a family funeral every day. There is an air of miserablism. Even a speech from the Prime Minister, the complete opposite to Tony Blair. This isn't things can only get better, it's things can only get worse. We are literally, yes, of course.
I thank the member for giving way. When you come into a new job and you discover that there's a £22 billion black hole, I think you'd look a bit miserable as well, don't you agree?
The idea of a 22 billion black hole is nonsense. It's 2.7 trillion. The national debt is massive. It exploded over the course of the last... It increased by 2.5 times over the course of the last 14 years, and it's set to go higher still. We are in much deeper difficulty economically. Even to talk about a £22 billion black hole is not to understand the problems that we've got. We have zero growth in this country. Foreign investment into Britain. Yes, there's money coming in, but it's not coming in anywhere near the rate that we need. We have got major, major problems. And I actually believe that this government has talked us into a recession because confidence is falling to that degree. And you might note that the more rapidly legal migration rises, the more rapidly the population expands, the poorer we get as individuals. The last 2 years have seen record levels of net migration into Britain. And in 6 of the last 8 quarters, GDP per capita has fallen. And this perhaps is the issue ultimately that I think is why people voted, or 3 million of them, asked for another general election. It is the breach of trust between Westminster and the country on immigration. I'm not even discussing the boats. I'm talking about a population that has risen by over 10 million in the last 20 years. The impact of that on primary school availability, the impact of that on housing, the impact of that on people's wages. That is the ultimate breach of trust. Now, Labour have not promised anything on legal immigration at all, but they need to be aware that if net migration figures are anywhere near what they've been in the last few years, confidence in their party will fall further. I think the whole system is in need of absolute fundamental change, and I suspect that what this is just a symptom, frankly, is a symptom of a much bigger cry for a different kind of politics in the United Kingdom. You can all con yourselves as much as you like. The old two-party system is breaking up before our eyes, and the next general election is going to see a very, very different Parliament. Thank you.
Ferguson.
Thank you, Mrs Harris. It is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. It's been an interesting debate so far, and like others, I thank those who signed this petition, those who came up with this petition. But ultimately, I believe this is a petition based on a false premise, the idea that you can kickstart economic growth within a single quarter of a new government after 14 years of a previous government. But not only that, we always talk about 14 years on this side. They don't really want to hear it on that side, and I dare say some Lib Dems don't want to hear it either. But in places like mine, it wasn't 14 years, because the global financial crisis was in 2018, so that's actually 16 years, 2 of which, regrettably, were under a Labour government. And in my community in the North East, in 2007, a year before that, people were queuing up on Northumberland Street in Newcastle to take cash out of cash points from Northern Rock, because Northern Rock was going bust. Our economy has not been functioning the way the people in this country would expect it to for the best part of 2 decades. And the idea that we can turn around 17+ years of failure in less than 17 weeks, I'm afraid, is for the birds. But I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised we're here discussing this today, because there is clearly a great well of discontent. But this petition, as I said, was cheered on by politicians, some of those who are opposite today, who lost a free and fair election, fair and square. And that was then amplified by a foreign billionaire, and I know people don't want to hear about foreign interference, but that is a fact, who used his platform and his algorithm to exacerbate this petition to the point where we are here, where we are today. Absolutely. So 4,000 people signed this petition, just over 4,000 people signed this petition in my constituency, Gateshead Central and Wickham. I'm not surprised that 4,000 people signed it. But 18,000 people plus voted for me and for the Labour Party on the 4th of July, just over 6 months ago. And I will not allow what effectively amounts to an online vote exacerbated by Twitter to overrule the votes of more than 18,000 people and everyone else who took part in that election on the basis of nothing more than that. Because we had a free and fair election in this country where every eligible adult was allowed to take part. And those who wanted to vote, voted. And the result of that vote was a majority for the Labour Party, and that is the way that we are going to govern. But we're going to govern for the majority of people in this country, whether they voted for us or not. Now, I know what I meant to say here, because the other side of the debate are going to say that Labour has misled people, that Labour has broken promises. And what I'm meant to say is, I'm meant to play my part, and I'm meant to reel off the litany of broken promises from the previous government. But do you know what? I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to. No, I'm not. No, but there's a very serious point to be made here, because in British politics, the standard used to be that we would disagree with each other, that we would make our points, and the other side would agree or disagree on the basis of those arguments. But that's not how British politics works now, and I'm very sad to say that. The way that British politics works now is that one side makes their arguments and the other side sows distrust in those arguments. They say that we're all liars. If we're all liars, I'm a liar. They say that I'm a liar. They say that you're a liar. They say that we're all liars. And they say that on that basis, no one should trust any of them. Well, I'm not going to do that, because I believe that the vast majority of members of Parliament are honourable and respectful people. I won't have this lie that members of Parliament are disconnected from their communities. In my 6 months as a Member of Parliament, I have never felt more connected with my community. I have never spoken to more of my neighbours. I have never been more engaged with the business of politics and the business of my community. And I believe that that is the same regardless across this House. And I genuinely have great disagreements with many of those who've spoken in this debate today. But I am not going to play this game of sowing distrust, because ultimately that damages our democracy, it damages our politics, and it damages the British people. So instead, I'm going to talk about the promises that Labour has kept. I'm going to talk about the New Deal for Working People that will make a radical change to the rights of people at work in this country. People like those in my constituency of Gateshead Central and Wickham. The changes that are being made on energy to make us an energy-independent country. Planning reforms and building houses so that my son and that all of your children and grandchildren will have the homes they need to live in. Bringing the railways back into public ownership so that they function for our benefit once again. And a budget that we had last year that invests in public services rather than cutting them. Disagree with that if you will, but do not use it to sow distrust. Let us have political arguments in this country, because the way we do things at the moment, this is not who we are, this is not the way we do things, and this is not what a good democracy looks like. Let us be better.
Yeah. Lamont.
I also pay tribute to the Honourable Member for Caithness, Sutherland and Easter Ross for moving the motion so well on behalf of the Petitions Committee, of which I am a member. Mrs Harris, most new governments come into power with positive plans to get things done quickly. They're often defined by early successes in their first 100 days in office, and they move fast to deliver on election promises. But this Labour government is not normal. There's been no positivity. Everything has been doom and gloom. In their first few 100 days in office, they've lurched from one disaster to another, and they've broken just about every promise they made before the election. Let's just look at some of the promises that they have shattered to pieces. Labour promised not to increase national insurance. Broken. Labour promised not to raise taxes on farmers. Broken. Labour promised not to scrap the winter fuel payment. Broken. Labour promised to compensate WASPy women. Broken. Labour promised to protect single-sex spaces. Broken. Labour promised no cliff edge in the North Sea oil and gas sector. Broken. Labour promised to cut energy bills. Broken. Labour promised £150 million war chest for the Scotland office. Broken. Now, wherever anyone stands on any of the individual policy issues, there is no doubt this Labour government has not kept its word. They've broken promises to voters that they made not once, not twice, but hundreds of times. In Scotland, their broken promises are letting the SNP off the hook. The Nationalists are benefiting because this disastrous Labour government is not delivering and sticking to anything that was promised pre-election. UK Labour are driving Scottish Labour into a ditch, and nobody in Scottish Labour has the backbone to stand up to them. Scottish Labour MPs voted through these broken promises, Anas Sarwar's MPs are content to not keep their commitments. Now, no wonder so many people in the Borders and across Scotland are losing trust in Labour. More and more people are moving away from Scottish Labour because they see they don't stand for anything except broken promises. They betrayed workers, businesses, pensioners, farmers and our oil and gas industry. They've broken their word on tax, on women's rights, on social security and energy bills. Anas Sarwar must be terrified of who this Labour government is going to hit next. Only the Scottish Conservatives are now standing up to the SNP and taking on the Nationalists. Under our new leader, Russell Finlay, we're reaching out to all those people who Labour have left behind. Everyone who feels disillusioned by Labour's empty, broken promises of change. Everyone who feels disconnected from what happens at Holyrood under the SNP and now what happens here under Labour. Everyone who wants politicians to show some common sense for a change. Labour won't represent those people, but the Conservatives will. Thank you.
Jim Dixon.
Mrs Harris, and can I say it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, and I'm very pleased at the opportunity to speak in this debate on the petition relating to a general election. And I'd like to thank very much those who are behind the petition and are here to listen to the debate on their petition this afternoon. And I know from the emails that I've had from residents in Dartford who have signed the petition that they have real concerns about some of the tough decisions that the new government has had to make. And I absolutely hear what they're saying to us. It's also, I think, as others have said, a sign that many people across this country have seen their faith that politics can bring positive change diminish altogether. And I think that is extremely unfortunate, and we need to rebuild that faith. It's hard to argue that they're wrong in that faith, given the legacy of 14 years of government under the party opposite. The basics of government went uncompleted, especially over the last decade. Far too little infrastructure was built, and a coach and horses was driven through both public services and the public finances, leaving them both in dire straits. In the constituency of Dartford that I represent, the plan for a new Lower Thames crossing, first proposed by the last Labour government in 2009, saw far too little progress and still isn't built, leaving residents in my constituency facing growing levels of traffic chaos. The current crossing operates continually over capacity, struggling daily with 50,000 vehicles on top of the capacity for which it was designed. Yet, as far as residents in Dartford can see, nothing has been done to make their lives better. I think it's instructive that some in this room even believe that the £22 billion black hole that we identified on assuming office is an underestimate of the problem that our new government faces in terms of public finances. But I would urge them to consider honestly, the members opposite, if they can really defend the record of the last government, a decade of growing NHS waiting lists even before the pandemic and stagnating living standards. The last government, in my view, never saw a crisis they couldn't make worse. Take an asylum system that was broken. They passed a law that stopped processing applications, leaving thousands in permanent limbo and with only the vague hope that the £700 million Rwanda scheme would fix anything. On NHS waiting lists, which they pledged to bring down, so we're talking about broken promises, we heard many times that the NHS waiting lists would be brought down. Instead, they grew and grew with no resolution to the strikes that were making them worse. And on housing, they set a target of 300,000 new homes a year. Yet, in a desperate attempt to appease their backbenchers, they made changes to the national policy planning guidance that have led to the supply of homes falling through the floor. Is it any wonder that people have doubts about the ability of any government and us as elected members of this place to deliver positive change for their lives? Yet, like other members who have spoken, I do remain hopeful. Yes, democracy can seem slow, and yes, change can seem incremental, but I have faith in this government to deliver the change our country needs and prove that people's votes at the ballot box can lead to better lives across our country. We set out in our manifesto that was intended to be for the full length of this Parliament. Let's not forget that. Our plans and our plans announced in the recently enunciated plan for change, that we will make change for this country. We will, unlike the last government, build the homes that families across this country so desperately need. And in Ebbsfleet, in my constituency, a further 10,000 homes are planned over the next decade. We'll get the NHS back on its feet, and today's announcements were enormously encouraging, so that we can see that neighbourhoods that are most in need will see a reduction in waiting lists, and we'll see a health service that actually has the capacity to support all our residents, so that in my constituency of Dartford, our Darrant Valley Hospital will have the capacity it needs to treat my constituents in Dartford. And I believe we will build the infrastructure that our country needs for the 21st century. And I hope in the new year, and in the new year we have upon us, the Lower Thames crossing will also get the go-ahead. But we will also see investment in homegrown, clean energy that will bring with it the jobs for the future. We will be rightly judged at the end of this Parliament if we have delivered on our manifesto, improved lives and set the foundations of our future prosperity. That will be the time for electors in Dartford and across the country to make their choice of a future government, not now. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Damian Hines.
Thank you very much, Mrs Harris. It's a pleasure to see you in Chair, and I thank the Chair of the Select Committee for introducing this debate today. This petition has succeeded already in a very important way because it has brought this debate to Westminster Hall this evening. And it's a broader debate, actually, than often we end up being able to have, and it's been passionately argued on both sides with some important points made. I was particularly struck by some of the points made by the member for Gateshead, Central and Wickham. And he is absolutely right that representative democracy can do some things that social media and other fora cannot, and it's why it's so important that we do have these debates in this place and that governments are held properly to account and give an account of themselves. Look, there are always people who are unhappy with a government, always people who are going to be unhappy with an incoming government. But the speed of the fall of this current government really is quite striking. There were very, very high hopes for this new Labour government, and they have been very, very speedily dashed. Now, no petition in our system can force a general election. That is all about the decision of the Prime Minister of the day, or if he or she is forced by a vote of confidence. But I do hope, genuinely, that the government will reflect on the scale of this petition, because we have lots of petition debates, lots of petitions get made to this Parliament, but the scale of this one and the rapidity with which signatures have been gathered is truly striking. In East Hampshire, 5,288 signatures by the start of the year. And people in East Hampshire feel particularly let down by things like the family farm tax, which is going to undermine the whole structure of agriculture in our area, which underpins the rural economy and society, with business rates, which was painted as a cut, but actually is an increase, particularly for retail and hospitality businesses, which will undermine the small businesses in our market towns and our village centres. The unrealistic housing targets that are being visited upon the countryside, even while cities like London will have their housing targets cut. And of course the hike in employer national insurance contributions painted as not being a tax on working people, when everybody knows that in the end such a tax can only see through either in the wages that people are paid or in the level of employment, and that will harm jobs locally. And of course scrapping the winter fuel payment right down to a very, very low income level. It is always, when you judge a government, it's always not just about what was in their manifesto that you judge them on. It was things that were not in their manifesto which they did anyway, and the most striking of those with this government so far has indeed been the winter fuel payment. This was a Blair-era reform that's been kept ever since, and throughout all the years, from 2010 through to 2015 and beyond, when we had to make some really difficult decisions, by the way, facing a 155 billion black hole inherited from the previous Labour government. For all those incredibly difficult decisions, one thing that was never touched was the winter fuel payment, because it is a particularly well targeted, not in terms of the number of people, but in terms of the time of year, for an expense that is that comes to older people right in the middle of winter, exactly when they need it. And in the budget, we heard for weeks from the Chancellor about the importance of economic growth. It was something I think everyone on our side, we all agreed with. It was fantastic to hear. Of course, economic growth ultimately is what matters, for not only for driving the economy, but for affording the excellent public services that we all value so much. There was a reasonable expectation that it was going to be the most growth-focused budget we had ever had in this country. And so a huge disappointment then when there were no major growth-driving measures in the budget at all. And in fact, the budget saw the forecast for growth actually fall. And everything this government has done has been continually focused on this supposed £22 billion black hole, which is itself, by the way, a mix of one-off items and recurring items, so it can't be considered a single figure at all. But in any case, look, whenever you're a government minister, you come into a new department, on your day one or day two briefing, you get told the long list of unfunded in-year spending pressures. That's not a black hole. It's a management challenge. It's what you have to deal with. It is what you have to deal with as a government minister in any department or at a macro level at the Treasury. And you make choices about how you do it, and you'll be held to account for those choices. Now, even in this 24-hour media and social media age, government is still not actually a popularity contest. And most governments will look over a 4 or 5 year period and they will try to do the unpopular things in year one, the difficult things, in the hope and expectation that they will yield positive results later. The difference this time around is when we look at what this government has done in year one, it is difficult to see how that is going to yield great results further down the line. I talked at the start about high hopes being dashed. I think actually that would certainly be true not only for members of the public, but for Labour activists and indeed for Labour MPs. I think there had been a belief that just by being a Labour government, things would improve. And I wonder if, when they look back, they might regret adopting that as their anthem. Things can only get better. It isn't true. It is all about the decisions that you make. And I hope this government, reflecting on this petition and this petition debate, will take the opportunity to rethink some of it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. As far as the petition before us is concerned, I'll make the obvious point which other members have made before me. We had a general election 6 months ago and the nation spoke. It delivered a landslide victory for my party, the Labour Party. We made it perfectly clear before, during and after the election as to the scale of the task at hand after 14 years of Tory failure. No one said it was going to be easy. No quick fixes were offered. We're not a government of populist, easy sound bites with no real solutions. We made it very clear that such was the scale of national renewal required right across the UK, that our government's missions would require years, not weeks or months. But this government has demonstrated already its determination to take the hard decisions to stabilise our economy and begin the process of growth and renewal. Today is a prime example. Others want to pander to populist nonsense at the start of a new year. Worse still, echo dangerous foreign influences. This government, my Labour government, and my Prime Minister today, at the start of a new year, instead is setting out how we'll reform the NHS from top to bottom and drive down waiting times, whilst others want to promote the frankly risible suggestion that we should have another general election just because they don't like and can't respect the outcome from just 6 months ago. In my constituency of Western Bartonshire, in July, we elected a Labour MP and therefore helped elect a Labour government for the first time since 2010, with 48.8% of the vote. That's a very clear mandate. We don't grant a rerun just because some people don't like the result. No, we'll go on with our plan for change, and in doing so, demonstrate that the truth matters, and also that democracy and defending democracy matters. In July, Scotland and Western Bartonshire voted for change. The work to deliver that change and honour our election promises is, in fact, already happening. Our first historic budget delivered the largest settlement to Scotland in the history of devolution, with £5 billion extra for the Scottish Government to spend in vital services. Labour's budget marks an end of austerity and provides the funding required for our NHS, our schools and public services in Scotland to reduce hospital waiting lists and provide fair funding to local councils. The work to deliver the GB Energy Company has started at pace, and it will be headquartered in Scotland, delivering energy security, lowering bills, good jobs and climate action. One of my biggest promises to the people of West Dunbartonshire was to help introduce day one employment rights, to increase the national living wage and make work pay, and we're delivering. And we're delivering a pay rise for over 3 million of the lowest paid workers across the UK, £1,400 pay boost for full-time workers. Our Labour government delivered the funding required for the regeneration of the town centres in my constituency and in my communities, the investment required to transform Dumbarton and the £20 million required for Clydebank Town Centre. There is plenty of more work to do. West Dunbartonshire, Scotland and the UK's best days lie ahead of us. This is not a serious proposition before us today, but what we do have now is a serious government, determined to get on with the business of delivering change. And in our Prime Minister, and I hope I'll get this quote correct, not only is he a hero who makes us look cool, he is, more importantly, the Prime Minister who will see us through this decade of renewal and deliver the change that the UK voted for. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Yeah. Sir John Whittingdale.
Thank you, Mrs Harris. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I'd also like to thank the Chair of the Petition Committee for introducing the debate, and through him Mr Michael Westwood, who has given us an opportunity to debate these matters. I am proud to rise to speak on behalf of the constituents of Malden, 8,057 of whom had signed the petition by the time of the start of this debate. It's probably increased even further since then. We are the second highest constituency, beaten only by the electors of my honourable friend, the member for Brentwood and Ongar, who I'm sure would be here as well were he not serving on the front bench. I have to say that I share the sentiments behind the petition in full, but as has already been pointed out, clearly under our system, the ability to have another general election does not exist unless there is a remarkable change in the view of either the Prime Minister or of Parliament. Our system is designed to deliver a, quote, strong and stable government, and most of the time it does that, and I remain a supporter of the system of government, even though I understand the anger felt by the honourable gentleman who spoke from Clacton. It is the case that our system was built essentially for when there were two main parties, with perhaps a third minority. We now have not just a third, but a fourth, and even in some areas a fifth minority, and that has produced this extraordinary result that the present government has a majority of 100 seats in Parliament, having achieved fewer votes than that party achieved under the leadership of the last leader of the Labour Party, the member for Islington North. But that is the system that we have. But I think the reason why this petition has attracted such support and so quickly is the fact not that people just dislike what this government is doing, but they do feel, as the petitioner sets out, that it is a direct breach of the promises that were made to the electorate at the time of the last general election. Even within a few weeks of the election, I was receiving angry emails from pensioners who had been misled. They had listened to claims by Labour spokesmen during the election that if they voted Conservative, a Conservative government might abolish the winter fuel allowance. The implication of that was that a Labour government would be safe and would protect the winter fuel allowance. And yet a few weeks later, it was announced that it would go. That was followed a few weeks later by the farmers. The farmers in my constituency had been to the NFU conference. They had listened to the leader of the Labour Party tell them from the platform that there was no intention of the Labour government to get rid of agricultural property relief.
And yet, in the budget, that was precisely what was announced, with the consequence that families who have farmed in my area for generations, going back to their great-grandparents, now say that they are going to have to sell up because they will not be able to afford the inheritance tax bill. I've also had letters from small businesses who understood that working people would not see a tax rise, and yet they are the people who employ those working people, and now find that their entire profit has been wiped out by the increase in national insurance contributions, with the result that they are either going to have to scrap pay rises this year, or in some cases actually lay off staff. And then, in my area, well represented in the petition, as my honourable friend from Rochford has pointed out, in Essex, we are faced with what was already a massive amount of development taking place with no corollary in terms of infrastructure. And yet, the new housing targets that have been imposed in Chelmsford represent an increase of 100% on that which was already being required. In Malden, in Malden it was 100%, in Chelmsford it was 60%. And yet there is no sign of the infrastructure investment. And those targets are being imposed on our local communities, despite the Labour Party saying that they would take account of the feelings of local communities. In all these areas, people listened to what they were told in the election and found that actually the new government has done precisely the reverse of what was promised.
Am I right, my friend?
Of course I'll give way.
I'm completely opposed to increasing VAT on school fees. But Labour did at least put that in their manifesto. As my right honourable friend constituents, have they spoken to him in the way that mine has spoken to me, and said one of the reasons they're so angry about the decision on winter fuel allowance is it wasn't in the manifesto, they weren't told that's what they were voting for, and therefore Labour have no mandate for it at all.
I entirely sympathise with the point made by my right honourable friend, and it is the case that winter fuel was a very direct breach of an undertaking given. But even VAT on schools, which he correctly says was actually in the Labour Party manifesto, but it was said that the money that was to be raised, if there is indeed any money, which I think a number of us doubt, but that would be invested in employing teachers and go into schools. And yet we have now heard in the last few days that there is no guarantee of that at all. It will just go into the Treasury. And the assurances that were given about how this would benefit state pupils have proved, again, worthless. Ms Harris, there is not going to be an election unless something extraordinary happens. Under our system, only the Prime Minister or Parliament can call an election early. And if we look back, I suspect the Leader of the House is the only other one here who can remember when the Labour government was brought down in a vote of confidence in 1979. I think with a majority of 170, that is probably unlikely to happen. Prime Ministers who have called elections earlier than 5 years that has not always been a wise decision, as indeed was certainly the case in 2017 and indeed arguably in 2024. So the truth is, we are likely to have this government in power for probably the next 5 years, but I believe it is unlikely to be longer. We will use that time to regain the trust. The new leader of the Conservative Party is right, that we have work to do. We didn't get everything right. Indeed, we made some bad mistakes, and we need to learn from that. And just as the Conservative Party did in 1974 and in 1997, we reflected on the reasons why we lost, and we worked hard to regain trust. But in the meantime, of that 5 years, we also have a job to do to hold this government to account. And I echo the remarks of the Father of the House. Even if this debate does not bring about a general election, I hope that members on the government side will listen to the voices expressed in the terms of the 3 million signatures on the petition.
Costigan.
Thank you, and it is a pleasure to serve under your chairship, Ms Harris. Chair, I understand that the people who signed this petition feel angry. And a lot of people are angry in my constituency of Ealing Southall. They're angry because their kids can't buy a home. They're angry because their parents can't get the hip operation they need. And they're angry because when their car gets nicked or their house gets burgled, the police don't seem to be able to do much about it. But it's clear where the blame for this lies. The Conservative Party have been in charge of this country for the last 14 years. It was the Conservative Party who didn't build the affordable homes we need. It was the Conservative Party who ran our NHS into the ground. And it was the Conservative Party who drastically reduced the number of neighbourhood police officers on our streets. And that's before I even get on to how they trashed the economy, with mortgages going up by the hundreds of pounds overnight and left us with a £22 billion black hole in the country's finances. I understand it's easy to get distracted, to start blaming other people for the mess the country was left in. But this just lets the Conservatives off the hook for the damage they've done to our public services and to our economy. Now, because we live in a democracy, on the 4th of July, people were asked to decide what they wanted through the ballot box. And they said they wanted change. They wanted a break with 14 years of Conservative chaos. Now, I understand that people might want that change to happen fast. They might want a quick fix. If only we could wipe away all of the damage of those 14 years of Conservative misrule in an instant, or even in a few months. But life doesn't work like that. Change takes a serious plan. It takes hard graft, and it takes time. So that's why this Labour government has launched our plan for change. It sets out what we're going to do to fix the NHS, to put police back on our streets, and to build the affordable homes we need. And the budget last year was the first step in how we stabilise our broken economy so that we can pay for it all without increasing taxes on working people. But most importantly, our plan for change gives people the tools to be able to check in 4 years' time at the next election whether we've delivered what we promised. People will be able to check if waiting lists have gone down, if there are more neighbourhood police, and if it's easier for their kids to get on the housing ladder. They'll be able to check if their local school has a free breakfast club, if there are more qualified teachers, and if their energy bills are based on cheaper homegrown energy instead of rocketing up every time Putin sneezes. Chair, what would Brenda from Bristol say about this petition's call for a general election? I think she'd say, not another one. And I think she'd rightly say, we should stop wasting our time debating pointless motions and get back to the hard work this Labour government is doing of fixing the damage the Conservatives have done to our economy and to our public services. Thank you.
Well done. Thanks. Thank you, Ms. Harris. And I would like to begin by congratulating the organiser of this petition, my constituent in Kingstonford and South Staffordshire, Michael Westwood. The Honourable Lady for Bolton, South and Walkden suggested that this petition was motivated by political partisanship. She seemed to suggest that it was the result of foreign interference. As far as I know, Mr Westwood is not and has never been a member of any political party. I'm very happy to give way.
Yasmin Qureshi.
What I said was misinformation, as well as foreign interference, as well as criticising. So it's three things I mentioned, not just one.
My good.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure that that's entirely helped her case. There's certainly no reason to imagine that Mr Westwood was in any way influenced by any foreign state or other foreign actor. What he is the owner of a small business in the in just a moment in the Black Country, who has seen the impact of Labour's broken promises it's already having on his businesses and businesses like his
and on the wider economy. So I think the Honourable Lady really does owe Mr Westwood an apology, which I hope she will deliver in private after this debate. But if she wishes to deliver it in public during the debate, I'll of course give way.
Thank you very much. At no time did I say the individual constituent was being influenced by foreign. No, I did not say that. What I said is that the petition on its own, as it's sold, has been motivated by a number of factors, but not at any time did I attribute anything to the individual constituent of yours.
Thank you, Ms Qureshi. I think your point has been made and noted.
Yes,
Mike Woods.
I think the words speak for themselves. Mr Westwood is literally sitting there, having brought the petition forwards, having gained those 3 million signatures, the signatures that reflect the strength of public dissatisfaction, frustration and betrayal with this Labour government's failure to uphold the promises it made during the election campaign. Political parties are elected based on manifestos that outline their vision, their commitments to the public. When those promises are not fulfilled, or worse, are abandoned, then trust between the electorate and the government erodes. Voters invest not only their votes, but also their hopes for the future in the government they elect. Where those promises are broken, as they so clearly have been here, where those hopes are dashed by the government going back on that platform on which they were so recently elected, then people have every right to feel betrayed. They feel betrayed by a government that categorically promised to not increase national insurance contributions, but within months had hiked that very tax, threatening wage growth for workers and hammering small businesses in particular. They feel betrayed by a Prime Minister who challenged his predecessor at PMQs to rule out restricting winter fuel payments, but within weeks of entering Downing Street, he took those same payments away from 90% of pensioners. They feel betrayed by a government that promised to not change agricultural property relief, but then scaled back that relief, putting family farms, many of which have been farmed for generations, at risk. And they feel betrayed by a government that promised to deliver the fastest growing economy in the G7, but that took an economy that was actually growing faster than other countries in the G7 and turned it into one with no growth at all. The Labour Party knew full well what the situation was before the election, yet they cynically chose not to make their unpopular plans public. They waited until they were in power. Rather than being honest with the public in advance, they ducked that choice. They took the easy route instead. Now, few people will imagine that this petition or this debate might lead to an early election. Sadly, it's not going to happen. But this petition is another clear sign of the betrayal felt by so many voters and the collapse in the trust and the support that this government was lent last summer.
Agi Shankar.
It's a pleasure to contribute to this debate under your chairship, Mrs Harris. The new year offers a good opportunity to reflect on a busy 2024, which saw the country choose to elect a Labour government after a long and hard-fought election campaign. Though we are rightly proud of our democratic political system in the UK, we can't ignore the mistrust in our politics and some politicians. This mistrust has been inflamed by years of Tory chaos at the heart of government. The new government is made up of serious and principled political leaders who are committed to working hard and rebuild that very trust. Despite the challenges we face, I am proud that in our country, governments are elected by democratic processes. We vote for our representatives at polling stations or by post, not by an online petition. Voters had the opportunity to make their voices heard on July the 4th, and they did. They overwhelmingly voted for change with Labour. That's why, looking forward to 2025, it is absolutely vital the result of last year's election is respected. I know there will be voters who didn't want a Labour government in the first place. There will be other voters who don't agree with some of the tough decisions we've made in government so far. But none of this means we should rerun or revisit the election result. Voters will rightly have the opportunity to judge us on our record at the next general election. We encourage them to do this. That's the beauty of our democracy. I'd like to take some time to discuss Labour's record, because I am exceptionally proud of our initial achievements in government. It is through these achievements that we're delivering for working people, not only in my constituency of Derby South, but all across the UK, in contrast to the years of Tory chaos. We have grown up principled leaders in charge. This means that across government we're working hard to rebuild our economy, which the Tories broke, and the public services which they absolutely decimated. We put working people at the heart of everything this government does, and have announced significant increases to the national minimum wage. At a local level, this will mean an additional £1,400 per year for over 7,000 workers across Derby. We're working hard to rebuild our crash-strapped public services, which were damaged by Tory austerity. We've recently announced the most generous local government settlement since 2010. We've ended the junior doctors' strikes and made record investments in the NHS so that we can cut waiting lists. And we're breaking down the barriers to opportunity, rolling out free breakfast clubs. No child should be at school hungry. And that's not all. Whether investing in our roads, schools or the NHS, there's plenty more to be excited about that a Labour government can deliver in 2025. We are committed to delivering the real change across the country and building a record to be proud of. And at the next general election, it's then when people across our great nation will decide who governs. There is no need for an election now. There's a need for sensible, stable, steadfast government, and that's what Labour is providing.
Yeah. Sam Carlin.
Thank you, Mrs Harris, and it's a pleasure to have you in the chair today. I spent some time thinking about whether I wanted to come and speak in this debate today. I thought to myself, on our first day back, when I've got a lot to be getting on with, have I got the mental stamina today to listen to Conservative members opposite talking about how everything was rosy and bright before Labour came to power in July, our public services were fine and all was glorious? And that's pretty much the sense we've heard from them so far this afternoon. But if that picture were true, they might not be sitting over there on the opposition benches with the lowest number of MPs ever for their party, and their lowest share of the vote too. This Labour government inherited public services on their knees, kneeling on rotten floorboards, on top of crumbling foundations, maybe with some subsidence as well. And tough decisions were always going to be needed to deal with this and deliver the change we were elected to deliver. This government has an immense mandate to do that, to deliver that change and fix the foundations of our economy and public services. With over 400 constituencies electing a Labour MP, many of them, including my own in North West Cambridgeshire, doing so for the first time. The truth is that there are no easy fixes for the deep-seated issues the Conservatives have left us. And they know that, which is why we still see that short-term attitude from the Conservatives and Reform UK, pretending there are simple solutions that we just aren't taking. They also continually admonish us for bringing up this legacy. They literally groan every time we mention their £22 billion black hole. There we go, which doesn't surprise me. I wouldn't want to talk about it either if I were them, which is exactly why we will continue to do so until this mess is fixed. Of course, they're a bit busy fighting one another and within themselves right now, which the country plainly sees. A weird Christmas argument over membership numbers between Reform and the Conservatives is just the latest episode in a long-running saga, which I have no doubt will continue, and long may it continue, as it will just help more and more of the British public to see how totally unequipped and to solve Britain's problems either of these parties are. And speaking of reform, I know the member for Clacton is here in the room, so may I take the opportunity to offer him my sympathy over the apparent loss of a very large donation for his party from overseas, following some of that recent right-wing infighting. It's a very sad consequence. Now, turning to the petition itself. I know there is frustration in this country, lots of it, about politics not delivering for people. I met so many people during the election campaign and beforehand that expressed that sentiment to me. People have been let down for so long, and restoring their trust requires us to show that we can make a difference, and we will. The new government has already made significant steps forward in fixing the foundations of our public services after the Conservatives left them in decay and decline. For a start, this government has delivered a budget that has stabilised the economy, preventing a return to austerity after the Conservatives left the worst inheritance for a new government since World War II. We've announced a much-needed £22 billion increase in our NHS budget, after we were left with record waiting lists. And just today, we're announcing a plethora of measures to slash those record waiting lists, just as we did last time we were in government. We've set up GB Energy to put us on the path to clean, homegrown power, tackling climate change while many in right-wing opposition parties deny the existence of it, or at the very least deny the urgency of it. We've appointed a border security commander to strengthen our border security after the Conservatives so abjectly failed to do so. And this is one of the areas that angers me most about their record. They presided over the growth of a staggering backlog of asylum cases, diverting resources away from actually dealing with the issues in order to put them towards a totally unworkable Rwanda scheme to try and win political capital. Our new planning and infrastructure bill will completely reform the planning system to ensure that we can build the homes we need, tackling the housing crisis head-on, which is causing so much frustration. And our renters' rights bill will finally rebalance the relationship between tenants and landlords, finally reforming the private rented sector after the leader of the opposition admitted she had given up on the idea, in essence. The Passenger Railway Services Bill, now ACT, will bring railways back into public ownership when existing contracts with private operators expire, reforming the transport network and improving services for passengers. And by ending tax breaks for private schools, this government is putting the additional revenue right back into our state schools to fund 6,500 new teachers where the resource is sorely needed. And if the party opposite disagree with that, I suggest they put into their next manifesto that they will cut 6,500 state school teachers and use it to subsidise private education and see how that does them. I'll give way.
What number the number of teachers in this country has increased by during the last Parliament?
What number the number of teachers has increased by during this Parliament? I don't have that figure to hand, no, but we're going to recruit 6,500 of them.
I'll help him.
No, that'll
a lot more than 6,500.
Thank you. In 6 months, Labour has achieved more than the Conservatives did in 14 years. Barely a single achievement comes to mind when thinking of the governments from 2010 to 2024. If anyone has a right to feel shortchanged, lied to and let down, it's those who voted for the Conservatives in 2010, 2015, 2017 and 2019, not those who voted for Labour in 2024.
Mark Seawoods.
Thank you, Mrs Harris. It is a pleasure to serve under your chairship. I'd like to start by thanking those that organised the petition, including Mr Westwood, for securing this debate on today of all days. It is my birthday and I can think of no better place to be, so thank you very much for that. I'd also like to thank the Chair of the Select Committee for ably setting out the constitutional position of when the next general election will be. And we know that it will be held on or before the 15th of August 2029. It's the Prime Minister's decision as to when he wants to make that request, but the election must be held by then. Now, Labour did win a general election a little over 6 months ago with a huge mandate for the policies set out in our manifesto. We secured 9.7 million votes. In the same election, the Conservatives secured 6.8 million votes, Reform 4.1 million votes, and the Liberal Democrats 3.5 million votes. So given those figures, it's perhaps no surprise at all that there are lots of people unhappy with the outcome of the general election in July. Now, one of the stated reasons in the petition was that we are not going to fulfil our manifesto promises, that we've gone back on our manifesto promises, and that's why there needs to be a general election now. So that's what I'm going to focus my contributions on, because I want to address that point, because I think that nothing could be further from the truth. We are going to make the most of the full term we have in our government and in government to deliver on the policies that we have set out in our manifesto. Now, one of the first promises we made was to manage the public finances properly. to balance the books on day-to-day spending as any responsible government should. And we knew this one wouldn't be easy, but we are simply not prepared to continue with the fiction that there are no difficult decisions required to fund our NHS properly, to rebuild our schools, and to pay down the £22 billion black hole left by the former Conservative government. And if the parties opposite, and I include all of them in this, if they are serious about rebuilding trust in politics, about rebuilding trust in politicians, then they must stop pretending that there are no difficult decisions required to balance the books. They must actually set out exactly where the axe will fall if they were in government. They will not be taken seriously by the British public at the next general election unless they do. And just on that point, we must also remember the context in which the previous general election was called in the first place. The Conservatives did think they could get away with spending money they didn't have in government. They spent the National Reserve 3 times over in the first 3 months of this fiscal year. They promised compensation to the victims of the infected blood scandal without allocating a penny to pay for it. They did exactly the same to the postmasters. They promised 40 new hospitals, and they didn't allocate anything close to the money required to actually deliver them. And then they called an election that they thought they might lose so that somebody else could sort out the mess. We've heard it even here today. They are even still pretending, even now, that they wouldn't have given out a single penny in pay rises to our public sector workers. Our armed forces, of course, were very fortunate enough to receive the largest pay rise that they have received in 22 years. And I ask him whether he would support that. So, Mrs Harris, I am very happy to give way. I was just coming to the end of my point, by all means.
Francois.
As Hansard will show, no one said that we would not have given public sector workers a pay rise. No one on these benches uttered those words. But it was £9 billion that Labour awarded that were part of that supposed £22 billion figure. Does he contend that?
He would.
Thank you very much. I'm grateful for the honourable member's intervention. The simple fact is they have to make a decision about exactly how much they would have given in public sector pay rises. They chose to dodge that decision and hand it on to the next lot, to hand it on to us. And as a result of that, we have had to take decisions to close a £22 billion black hole that they knew full well they were leaving, that there was no way we could have known we were inheriting. Now, their financial mismanagement has led to this. The Conservatives have not changed, and unfortunately, given the intervention today and the contributions, they appear unwilling to do so. They are not serious people. We will get on with fixing their mess and fulfilling our manifesto commitments. Now, turning back to the manifesto, I'd encourage anybody to look at the progress we have made despite the inheritance that I've set out. A 3.3% increase in day-to-day spending on public services, a record £22.6 billion for the NHS to make sure that we can put on 40,000 new appointments every week and cut waiting times in our manifesto, an increase in the core schools budget so that we can recruit 6,500 new teachers in our manifesto, a rail nationalisation bill that takes back public control of our trains in our manifesto, a renters' right bill that bans no-fault eviction, a water measures bill that punishes those who pollute our water, a crime and policing bill to take back control of our streets, a Great British Energy Bill to deliver clean, secure energy, and the Employment Rights Bill that delivers workplace rights fit for a modern economy so that people are protected at work. Every single one of those things was in our manifesto. It will take us 5 years, but we will deliver the things that we set out in our manifesto. Now, I could go on, but I'm sure the members opposite will be very grateful and will forgive me if I don't. We will continue to deliver for working people in government. Now, to those that signed this petition in my constituency, I fully appreciate and understand your anger and your frustration. I do. But we were elected not to deliver quick fixes. We were elected to deliver long-term results for the United Kingdom. We will sort out this mess and we will leave our country in a better place than we found it, unlike the previous government. Now, 6 months is not enough time to fix all of our country's problems, but we will make real progress on them over the next 4 years. Thank you, Mrs Harris.
Wheeler.
Thank you, Mrs Harris. It's a pleasure, as always, to serve under your chairship, and I'd also like to extend my thanks to the chair of the Petitions Committee. On the 4th of July 2024, I was proud to be elected as the Labour MP for Worsley and Eccles. I stood on a manifesto of change, and 6 months ago, Labour was given a clear mandate from the British people to get on with the job of rebuilding the country, fixing our public services and making work pay. There should be no doubts about the size of this task. 14 years of Conservative government have left public services in a dire condition and people feeling the pinch in their pockets. On top of this, a flurry of unfunded promises left the country with a £22 billion black hole that it's up to this government to fill. 14 years, £22 billion. Clearly, a challenge of this scale is not going to be fixed overnight. However, this government has not sat idly by for the last 6 months. It has started the hard work of delivering change, delivering our manifesto promises and delivering the better future the people of this country deserve. Labour has committed an extra £25.6 billion of NHS funding over 2 years to meet our commitment to fix our broken NHS. This funding will be vital in cutting waiting times, and I was pleased to see the Prime Minister set out measures earlier today to deliver those 40,000 extra appointments every single week. Work has already begun on Labour's commitment to raise school standards for every single child. Since the election, it has been a genuine pleasure of mine to visit so many excellent schools in my constituency of Worsley and Eccles, and I'm acutely aware of the vital importance my constituents place on their children receiving a high-quality education. I therefore welcomed the government's decision to increase the core school budget by £2.3 billion next year to support the recruitment of 6,500 teachers and genuinely invest in our state schools. And as someone who regularly suffers on the West Coast Main Line and has never understood why the failed model of privatisation was allowed to continue for so long to the detriment of customers, I was proud to vote for legislation to fix our broken transport system, laying the groundwork for a publicly owned rail system working for the public once again. And this Labour government is only getting started 6 months in. I'm proud to see the important progress being made on delivering many of our other manifesto commitments that I was elected on. Whilst the previous government oversaw an economy blighted by insecure work, low pay and poor productivity, the Employment Rights Bill introduced by this government will deliver the biggest upgrade in workers' rights in a generation, meeting our commitment to make work pay. Measures within the bill, such as the end of exploitative zero-hours contracts, the end of fire and rehire, and the right to statutory sick pay from day one of an illness, will end the poor pay, poor working conditions and poor job security that have held too many people back for too long. In addition, a 6.7% increase in the national living wage will take effect from this April, with the Low Pay Commission's remit having been changed by this government so that it will now have to take into account the cost of living when setting new rates. The government is also taking action to provide secure homes, the secure homes that people need. I welcome the government's commitment to accelerate house building in order to deliver 1.5 million good quality homes and infrastructure. And for far too long, private renters have suffered from expensive, precarious and poor quality accommodation. I was proud to serve on the Renters' Rights Bill Committee, working on a bill which will level the playing field between tenants and landlords, banning the scandal of no-fault evictions and delivering a range of new protections. Finally, Chair, I note the introduction by this government of the Children's Wellbeing and Schools Bill, which will help break the link between young people's background and their future success, providing opportunity for all whilst delivering on our specific manifesto commitment of free breakfast clubs in every primary school. So, Chair, I'd like to finish by saying, less than 200 days ago, the British people endorsed Labour's manifesto and delivered a resounding call for change.
I believe that this government is working hard to meet the commitments made at that election. I welcome the progress that has already been made on delivering the promises, and I know that there is more to come. I look forward to facing my constituents at the next general election, when it comes, and standing on my record and the record of this Labour government. Until then, I will keep working every day for the people of Worsley and Eccles.
Yeah. To you, and I appreciate that what everyone is looking forward to at this time is yet a final speech, but it will perhaps be the final speech. I have been very interested. I didn't know how this debate would go. I was very interested in having the opportunity of coming here today to hear what people were saying, and I hope it's been somewhat useful to people who aren't used to being here, as well as people who have been here for 5 minutes like me. I was only elected in, as you know, like many people here in the election in July 24, and I have a majority of 152, which means I know that what I had to say wasn't universally popular with all the people that I was standing to try and represent. So I know I have a lot of work to do as the member of Chelsea and Fulham to try and persuade the people of the country that what we as a Labour government are planning to do and hope to do is going to be good and will prove to them in the long run that we should be re-elected. But I know there's a lot of cynicism out there. Of course there's a lot of cynicism out there. We attack each other a lot of the time. I hope we've learnt some things today. The problems were how many years are we having to make up for? 14. I just thought you might have forgotten that. But what we haven't done today is really explored, for me, a crux behind the motion. And that is that the manifesto made promises and we have not kept our promises. And a number of my colleagues have addressed this in passing and very well. And my colleague, my honourable friend from Gateshead Central and Wickenham, said we must proceed with facts and we must be decent, I think, if I can paraphrase you, in the way that we do so. Other people said that we were depressing. As a country, we talked the economy down, and that we had bringing the country into a stalemate. And I just think it's useful to remind us of what is good and positive and exciting about this Labour government, which was brought in to effect change. And I will do it in a very boring way, if I may. I will read you words from the manifesto. And I say this because I used to be the deputy leader of Hammersmith and Fulham Council in London. And we know that nobody believes what you put in a manifesto. It's almost a given. You know, 10 commandments come down and the lies in the manifesto is full of lies. So we used to stick them up. We stuck our manifestos up on the wall of the council cabinet chamber, and we ticked them off as we went along, and anybody who came in could see us ticking them off. So let me just tick off a couple of things which were mentioned today. We said in the manifesto, and this is the words, and I appreciate very few people here, other than keen Labour candidates such as myself, have read it. We said we will immediately abolish Section 21 no-fault evictions, trying to deal with a massive problem of rental, the cost of rental, the crap quality of so many places in which people are forced to live. We said we will prevent private renters being exploited and discriminated against. We said, quote, we will empower them to challenge unreasonable rent increases. We will take steps to decisively raise standards, including extending AWAB's law, that's about damp and mould, to the private sector. We have done this. We have introduced the Renters' Rights Bill, which was referred to. It's in the manifesto, and we've done it. Forgive me. I appreciate that, Chair. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And my apologies to the public gallery for turning my back on them. If I may, Chair, through you, say that. On new homes, we said, and I'm just going to boringly quote from the manifesto, which we accuse of not keeping our promises. Labour will get Britain building again. We will immediately update the national planning framework. That's in order to enable us to build 1.5 million homes. We're bringing in the new planning and infrastructure bill. We said we'll build an NHS fit for the future, and our immediate priority will be to get a grip on the record waiting list. I won't list all the things we've done. You can read tonight's news. Masses and masses, and including £25.7 billion, which we're putting in the NHS with money raised in the budget. And I appreciate not everybody has liked the way that we raise money in the budget, and they don't have to like it. I appreciate there will always be differences of opinion. But we have taken the money that we've raised and we've put £26 billion into the NHS. Another thing we said we'd do in the manifesto is we would improve inclusivity for children with special educational needs. We will ensure special schools cater to those with most complex needs, and we will improve mainstream education for disabled children.
£1 million of the money raised in the budget, and not everybody likes the way we raise the money in the budget, but £1 million of that has gone into improving education in mainstream schools for disabled children, children with special educational needs. We said, quote, Labour, we have a problem of people don't have enough money to live on, and the minimum wage is all that many people rely on. So we said, quote, we will make sure the minimum wage is a genuine living wage. We will change the remit of the Independent Low Pay Commission so for the first time it accounts for the cost of living, and Labour will also remove the discriminatory age bands so all adults are entitled to the same minimum wage. Well, we've raised the national minimum wage, we've raised the national living wage. That's a pay boost for 3 million people. We said in the manifesto we would do it. We've kept our promise. We've done it. We've asked the Low Pay Commission to end the discriminatory age bands and to look at including the cost of living. We've talked about Great British Energy. We made pledges there. We've delivered them through establishing Great British Energy. We said we would fund free breakfast schools. Quote, we will fund free breakfast clubs in every primary school accessible to all children. We're doing that. We're introducing free breakfast clubs. I'm sorry to quote from the manifesto at such length. Yes, of course.
Free breakfast clubs in secondary schools.
I'm sorry, yes.
Apologies, Mrs Harris. What does he think should happen to the free breakfast clubs in secondary schools?
I'm quoting.
Ben Coleman.
I'm not here to say what should happen to the free breakfast clubs in secondary schools. That is for a debate which we can have. What I'm here to say is, if you say if anybody here says that the Labour Party is not keeping its promises, I'm reading out the promises word by word so you cannot. Britain's, if I could talk about sewage, of which there's plenty, Britain's coasts, rivers and lakes are being polluted by illegal sewage dumping. Labour will put failing water companies under special measures to clean up our water. We've brought in the Water Special Measures Bill. It's had its second reading. It will strengthen regulation. Water companies can be fined. Bosses can be fined, we can ban bonuses, there'll be new environmental standards. It's all there in our manifesto and in what we've done. Yes, of course.
John Whittindale.
Give him a little more time. He's very keen to quote the Labour manifesto. Can I just ask him to comment on the third paragraph of page 1 of the manifesto, which says it contains a tax lock for working people, a pledge not to raise rates of income tax, national insurance or VAT.
Yeah, absolutely. No, this is where, and this is where. I'm sorry, I thought you wanted. Would you like me to answer the question? Sorry, or do you want to chat? Because I'm happy to wait.
Ben Coleman, can you resume your speech? Thank you.
This is where it is. This is where it becomes politics. What I mean by that is, we very clearly promised in the manifesto not to raise income tax or national insurance on working people. That was directly understood. We didn't promise, the Labour Party didn't promise not to raise it on the national insurance contributions of employers, and that's what's happened. And people, I understand the concerns that's raised, I understand the problems that's had. I'm simply saying we have done what we said we would do in the manifesto and we haven't broken our promises. And then no matter how much you professional gentlemen who've been here for 20 years yell at me from here who've been here for 6 months, it is simply the case that what is in our manifesto, which I'm reading out word for word, is what we're delivering. And on the borders, if I may just finish by talking about the borders, we said Labour will stop the chaos. We will go after the criminal gangs who trade in driving this crisis. We will create a new border security command with hundreds of new investigators, intelligence officers and cross-border police officers. Well, we've already increased the number of enforced returns of those who've committed crimes, have no right to be here, up nearly 30% on the same period last year, and we have established and invested in the Border Security Command, as we said we'd do. So yes, Madam Chair, disagree with the things we've done because you don't like them, because you never liked them, or you don't like what we've done now. But do not say that we have not kept the promises in our manifesto, because we have.
Thank you. Yeah. We now go on to wind-ups. Angus MacDonald for the Lib Dem wind-up.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Despite the 3 million people who signed this petition, we know that the government will continue to stand. That said, I think the petition has been an excellent thing, because I think it's let the government know how deeply unpopular many of their policies have been. And there are many members of Parliament from the government side who I feel are rather ashamed by many of the things which resulted in this petition. People people in the Labour Party, your voters, do feel very let down, and I'll expand on that in a second. Who would have thought that it would be the Labour Party who would, number one, cut the winter fuel payments for our older, more vulnerable people? Who would have thought the Labour Party would be the party to do that? Secondly, who would have thought that the charities, the GPs, the hospices, and the hundreds of thousands of smaller businesses would suffer a national insurance increase by 8.7%, almost 4 times the rate of inflation? Who would have thought they would do that? They have destroyed the economy and many of the charities. They really have. And who would have thought that the Labour Party would walk away from the commitment, maybe not written down, but certainly we've seen the photographs, of their commitment to the WASPI women? The Prime Minister would have been a much more compassionate person, have a much more compassionate budget, if he had increased the top rate of tax, both the income tax for the better off people and the corporation tax for companies making hundreds of millions, if not billions of pounds of profit. That would have been a much more compassionate decision. It would have been much more compassionate to tax the online companies that are making many billions of pounds in the UK. Maybe a percentage of revenue rather than a percentage of profit. So say 1.5%. That would have been something which almost everybody would understand. Now, the petition cannot result in a new general election, but the Prime Minister will know he is on notice. He now has a dissatisfaction rating reaching 61%, and the economic optimism in our country is collapsing. Almost universally, the people of Britain have been appalled by this budget. The Prime Minister and the Chancellor have let down the poorest people, the charities, and their struggling budget. And personally, as a Scottish MP, I'm appalled that he has done a big job in helping the Scottish National Party win the next Scottish Parliament election. So, not a good job, I'm afraid.
Shadow Minister Richard Holden.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Mrs Harris, for chairing today. It's a pleasure to see you in your position there. And I'd like to also extend my thanks, as many others have done, to the Honourable Member for Caithness, Sutherland and Easter Ross for the way in which he kicked off the petition debate today. But I'd also like to thank Michael Westwood, who's sitting in the gallery, for putting forward the topic for this debate. He has clearly caught the public mood with 3 million people in the petitions. Now, I know, Ms Harris, I shouldn't be referring to him, but I think given the amount of people who have caught the public mood and signed up to his petition, and I would just caution some of the members of the opposition who today, I remember one of them said, this is a debate on a pointless motion. Over 3 million people have signed up to this debate. Over 3 million people have signed up to it because they're really concerned about what the government's doing. I can understand why the Honourable Member for Gateshead Central and Wickham wants to move on from talking about whether Labour has fulfilled its manifesto commitments or not, and instead let's just try and move on and get away from this idea of a blame game, because there is a real concern here out there in the public that people were misled ahead of the general election this time. The Father of the House, I think, put it really well when he said that the government really should listen to people's frustrations, because these are real frustrations out there, up and down the country, when it comes to small businesses or family farms or ordinary working people or pensioners, thousands of whom have written to me in my own constituency about the concerns that they face. And while no one should be in doubt that the government elected 6 months ago is obviously unlikely to be facing a general election anytime soon, we should all acknowledge that the massive public support that this petition had gained, with 3 million signatures, and also honourable members opposite should also realise that we are now over 10% into their time in office. And if they don't start listening to the public, it might be 10% of their entire time in this place. Within my own constituency of Basildon and Billericay, seeing over 6,000 people sign up, nearby friends in my right honourable friends from Raleigh and Wickford and Malden, even more. It is clear that the the public feeling behind this position is actually based on the government's significant early failures. And that is an understandable perspective, given the government's primary method of governing so far has been consistently to break their biggest promises and then blame everyone else. As my honourable friend, member for Berwickshire, Roxburgh and Selkirk said, promises broken, I think it can reasonably be argued, in a manner that implies contempt for the public and has been highly damaging for the trust in this government. This government's failure and its broken promises started early, Madam Chairman. It was on the morning of the 5th of July that the new Prime Minister walked up to the door of Downing Street and talked about a government of service. Looking on with a new pass and new access was Labour major donor Lord Ali. From the off, it has been clear that the promises of integrity, accountability and transparency by this government have been broken. From the literal first day of the Labour government, the public cannot help but feel Labour was selling out and selling them short. Soon after, it came to light that this Labour government was using exceptional civil service appointment procedures to put Labour donors and activists into what fundamentally are meant to be politically neutral positions. And the sense that this government, even in its first few weeks, was systematically destroying the mechanisms that hold an elected government to account for the interests of the whole public, not just sits particularly difficultly with the people in this House, but I think sits badly with the public at large as well. Members will see in their inboxes, though, at their surgeries and in conversations, that there has been already an immense feeling of disappointment, perhaps increasingly anger, with what the public sees as the government's broken promises. It's not just the direction or integrity anymore, but also on the specific policies, which members have touched on from across the House. We know how frustrated the public are. Labour clearly promised not to raise taxes, but on entry into government, it's one of the first things they did. In their very first budget, this government announced an increase to employer national insurance contributions, which its own Chief Secretary to the Treasury admitted was effectively a tax hike on working people, because it is a direct tax on their jobs. Its own Chancellor had previously described this tax hike as a tax purely on people who work, because that is what it is, and that is what this government has done, in direct contravention of their own manifesto. The Institute for Fiscal Studies, politically independent, said very clearly that Labour is imposing, that this tax that Labour is imposing is a clear breach of their manifesto, and the government response was to flail over the definition of what a working person is. Rather than step up and be honest with the public, which is actually the essence of the petition that Mr Westwood has brought forward, this government has failed on that very basic test of clarity and honesty. Labour promised to stick by farmers. In truth, we all know what they did. They stuck two fingers up to farmers right across the country. Only a number of months before being elected, the now Environment Secretary said that this Labour government would not make changes to agricultural property relief. The now Prime Minister said that farmers deserved better. And then what did Labour do? They risked thousands of small family farms up and down the country by reducing agricultural property relief and imposing a new and fundamentally unsustainable tax on our farming community. The government's response? No honesty there, and I'll quote from the Environment Secretary: farmers will have to learn to do more with less. Wow. In their manifesto, Labour promised to protect the victims of crime. And what's been their record so far? Thousands of early releases, all massively extended, some of whom who went on to commit violent crimes. Labour's promised to deliver better outcomes for pensioners as well. Better outcomes for pensioners. They were the exact words in the manifesto the members opposite stood in the general election on. Better outcomes for pensioners. I wonder how many of them out there think that today. The Labour Party threw the pensioners out into the cold. We know they did this decision to cut winter fuel allowance for millions would lead to hundreds of thousands more in fuel poverty, in absolute poverty, in pensioner poverty, and the government knew it. So what did they do? They concealed their own analysis showing that this is what would actually happen, the devastating effect that cutting the winter fuel allowance would have. Slipped it out months after the policy had been announced unannounced, hoping that no one at all would notice. And what do? Break a promise, cover it up, time after time again. Energy bills, the same. What's the first duty of government? To protect the country. And what we've seen, that promise on 2.5% of GDP on defence spending, pushed back and pushed back and pushed back. The government have been repeatedly warned that they're seriously hurting our nation's ability to defend itself and leaving us less safe. Can there be any surprise that the public loses faith in a government who is leaving it less safe? Labour promised to give more opportunity to young people. All they've done is taken a class war to independent schools while trying to reverse really positive reforms from the last government and indeed from the previous Labour government, which actually helped provide great new schools right up and down the country. They are taking away opportunity from young people up and down the country. And it doesn't stop at the school gates. For the first time in over a decade, we've seen tuition fees increase, when, under this government, despite the Prime Minister having said he wanted to scrap them. Illegal migration, another one. They've literally removed any deterrents we've got left and instead replaced our deterrent with a slogan, not a policy, saying they'll smash the gangs, but who knows how on earth they even plan to do it. And that just takes us on to more. Look at what they're doing. The Honourable Member for Dartford, I couldn't believe it, mentioned the Lower Thames crossing, a decision that's been literally put off twice already under this government. Put off twice. Already hundreds of millions of pounds invested under the last government. The decision's waiting to go, but the cash is already there. It's even got its own separate area of policy, an area of spending, but totally removed. And so when it comes to drivers, worse off. And then let's look at what else they've done on transport. Bus passengers. Scrapped the Get Around for £2 bus fare scheme literally a few days ago, seeing people paying an extra £10 a week at least, and that's going to be scrapped in total literally in a few months' time. As colleagues from Essex have also mentioned, that huge hammering on housing. That promise that local people will be consulted. Yet my constituents are facing 27,000 extra homes in Basildon and Billericay. We've seen London, our housing target, slashed by 17,000. Yet all across the home counties, an actual increase of 18,000 a year. That doesn't sound like consultation with local people to me. It sounds that a failing Labour mayor in London is basically having to be bailed out by the people of the home counties like ours in Essex. It is understandable that people wanted change and fast. This petition expresses the wish for the public who want to see a government based on honesty. That's the change they want to see. They want to see a government that's prepared to be honest. And if the government's PPS wants to start speaking in this debate, he should resign and start taking his seat and do that. This government's response, though, is to say that it has voted on a specific measure. The government's response consistently has been to say, no, don't worry. This is about a broader mandate. This is actually about general principles. Start to move on from the manifesto. So let's examine what they said. They said they'd kickstart the economy. In fact, what have they done? Their missions have failed and they have changed. Their goals have been so frequently moved that it's hard to keep track. I think we can all probably agree that economic growth lay at the heart of what Labour were talking about in the run-up to the general election. So where is it now? Well, it's actually ended. There is no economic growth. As honourable friends on this side of the House pointed out, in the 6 months before the general election, the fastest growing economy in the G7. What happened since? Flatlining. Absolutely nothing. The honourable gentleman's right when he puts his hand down like that. That's exactly what his government has done to the country. And it was interesting to mention what the honourable member for Leeds, that's right, Leeds South West and Morley, said. He said, what about the inheritance? And I really thought that was an interesting thing. When we came into office, literally £1 in every 4 that the government spent was borrowed. That's what a really tough inheritance looked like. That's nothing. The Labour government coming in now, look at what was happening, the fastest growth in the G7. No deficit of 11.1% of GDP. Look at the inheritance that actually the last Labour government left. And my greatest fear at the moment, and I think this is a fear which actually petitioners are starting to think about as well, is what is a legacy? What is actually this Labour government going to leave as a legacy for their families and our country for the future as well? That's what they're fearing. They're fearing that we might exactly see that legacy and I will quite wind up now, Madam Chairman. Labour promised honesty, but instead they dished out broken promises, a Chancellor accused of lying about her experience, and a Transport Secretary revealed to have had a criminal conviction. Frankly, it is increasingly obvious that Labour sold the country a false promise. They sold the people a false promise, so it is no surprise that this petition has received so many signatures. But sadly, this government has dismissed the petition, as have members here today, dismissed the voices of the public. This Labour government is giving the impression that it just doesn't care, that it feels above the sentiments of the public. And while I'm sure it would be easier for the government and the public, they would just want the public to just shut up and go away for a few years. Just let them get on with the job. I have to tell the government that every day of this Parliament, that this side of the House is going to be holding them to account for their manifesto. The public out there aren't stupid. They can see exactly what's happening and this government is doing in office. And I would suggest that the Labour members here today, they would do well to take serious notice of the discontent that has been displayed by Mr Westwood and the over 3 million people who've signed it. Or else, not only will trust in the government fall further, we will continue to decline, and this government will face nothing but further anger and further disappointment from the public. Thank you very much.
Government Minister Ellie Reeves.
Thank you, Mrs Harris, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. I would like to thank the Honourable Member for Caithness, Sutherland and Easter Ross for moving this motion. He does so on behalf of the signatories of the E-petition, which asks for a general election. And I welcome the fact that the creator of the petition has been able to listen to the debate in the gallery today. May I also welcome all of those who have spoken in this debate back to the House and wish you a happy new year. I'm grateful for the opportunity to respond to this petition debate on behalf of the government. I have yet to determine if the leader of the opposition has added her name to the petition following the comments she made at her third outing at Prime Minister's Questions. But I must say that opposition appears to be suiting her extremely well, and I wish her and her colleagues many more happy years on the opposition benches, signing petitions to their heart's content. As honourable members may be aware, I served as Labour's Deputy National Campaign Coordinator in the run-up to the general election. So the prospect of another general election so soon after the last one and a return to the 5 a.m. daily starts fills me with what I can only describe as joy. Thankfully, as a number of honourable members have said today, our political system does not work on the basis that those who do not like the result of any particular election are granted a rerun. In the words of the member for Boston and Skegness, you back the will of the people and the losers have to consent to the winners. That's how democracy works. Without such a system, there would have been many elections in recent years where my party, no doubt, would have been tempted to request a rematch. Of course, the lesson that we learnt, which the party opposite shows no signs of understanding, is the route back to government lies not in signing petitions calling for another general election, but facing up to the reasons you lost and fixing them. That is what, under the leadership of my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, we did. And that is why 6 months ago, this government was elected with the largest majority that any party has secured since 1997. As my honourable friend, the member for Hamilton and Clyde Valley, said, we were elected with a clear mandate for change. That is what we are delivering. And indeed, as my honourable friend for North West Cambridgeshire said, this government has already achieved more in its first 6 months in office than the previous government managed in their 14 years in power. The Chancellor has delivered a budget which stabilised the economy, prevented a return to austerity and protected working people's payslips. And as my honourable friend, the member for Derby South, has said, we have announced £22 billion more for the NHS and ended the doctors' strike. Yeah. We are increasing the schools budget by more than £2 billion. We've set up GB Energy and lifted the ban on onshore wind to help deliver clean power by 2030. I'll give way.
Mike Wood.
I thank the Minister for giving way. She refers to the promises made on GB Energy. Obviously, before the election, Labour Party promised that their plans would result in energy costs for households being reduced by £300. By when does she expect energy prices to be £300 lower?
Minister Reeves.
Achieving our target of clean energy by 2030 not only will give us energy security so that we're not at the whim of tyrants like Putin, it will also help us to meet our targets for net zero and give consumers energy security. That is why that is central to what this Labour government is trying to achieve, and it's why it's one of our core missions. We've also set up Border Security Command to smash the gangs and returned almost 13,500 people with no right to be here. We've published our National Policy Planning Framework to pave the way to 1.5 million homes this Parliament, accompanied by the infrastructure to support them. And we've introduced legislation to deliver the biggest upgrade to workers' rights in a generation and to transform the experience of private renting, which many honourable members have spoken about today. And as my honourable friend for Hitchin, amongst others, said, all of this has been against an extremely challenging backdrop. Of course, no government chooses the circumstances in which it comes to office, but there is no doubt that the previous administration left us the worst inheritance of any post-war government. As many of my honourable friends have noted today, a £22 billion black hole in the public finance. Not a management challenge, as the member for East Hampshire would like to have us believe, but a wrecking of the public finances by the previous Conservative government. Yeah. The worst Parliament on record for living standards and an unprecedented slowdown in wage growth. NHS waiting lists at 7.6 million, with 300,000 people waiting longer than a year for treatment. New home approvals that had dropped to record lows, higher energy bills and a weakening of our energy security, shoplifting at record highs and knife crime that had risen by 86% since 2015. An open borders policy. They promised to reduce net migration to under 100,000 and left us with a situation where that figure was almost 10 times higher. They don't like us talking about it. They groan and chunter, but that is the reality of their record. And of course, all this has meant the government has had to take hard decisions, not all of which will be popular with everyone. But we will not shy away from making the big calls that are right for the country's future, because that is what any responsible government must do. And we're not stopping there. As my honourable friend for Ealing Southall spoke about, in our plan for change published last month, we set out what we will deliver for the British people during this Parliament. It starts with raising living standards in every part of the United Kingdom, so that working people have more money in their pockets no matter where in the country they live. We will also build 1.5 million homes and fast-track planning decisions on at least 150 major infrastructure projects. That is more than in the last 14 years combined. A healthy economy must be built on a healthy population, which is why the Prime Minister set out our elective reform plan to tackle waiting list backlogs through millions of more appointments, so the NHS once again meets the 18-week standard for planned treatment. Feeling safe in your community is a fundamental right for every citizen. That is why we're providing 13,000 additional officers, PCSOs and special constables in neighbourhood teams in England and Wales, so every community has a named officer to turn to. Our plan for change also commits us to securing homegrown energy whilst protecting bill payers. We want to be on track for clean power by 2030. And finally, giving children the best start in life by ensuring that a record percentage of 5-year-olds in England are ready to learn when they start school. That is a priority for this government. That is the change the country voted for so decisively last year. That is the change we are delivering, and that is what we will carry on doing. With the House only returning from the Christmas recess today, I'd hoped to be able to carry through into the new year a spirit of peace on earth and goodwill towards all colleagues from all parties. But I'm afraid I must disappoint those who, only 6 months after the general election, now want a rerun. They are, of course, entitled to voice their opinions, and this government is committed to serving everyone in the country to the best of our ability, no matter who they voted for. But having secured such a resounding victory at the general election last year, we have not only the right, but also the responsibility to implement our programme and the change the country voted for. That is what we will do, and when the next election eventually comes, we will be proud to stand on our record.
Hear, hear. For the Petitions Committee, the Select Committee Chair, Jamie Stone.
Mrs Harris, thank you very much. It is a winter's night and the hour gets late, so I shall be very brief indeed. But in the words of Bruce Forsyth, didn't they do well? We've had a full and frank exchange of views, and could you imagine that happening in the Duma or perish the thought Pyongyang? Because that is one thing we do very, very well in this country. We actually debate things properly. That's the British way of doing democracy. So my thanks to each and every member on all sides of this House who spoke. My thanks too to my fellow members of the Petitions Committee, and in particular my thanks to the wonderful staff who support us on the committee. And finally this debate would not have happened if it hadn't been for the good people out there who put their names to that petition. And I think each and every one of them can feel that they have tonight been part of democracy. That's how we do things in this country. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered E-petition 700143 relating to a general election. As many of that opinion say aye, of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it, the ayes have it. Order, order, the sit-in stands adjourned.